Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Naomi Dewar. I'm the vice mayor. The mayor's not able to join us right at this time, but it looks like we do have a quorum of both bodies, so we'll call the meeting to order. And I'd like to ask our clerk, let's just see here. We're going to, before we even approve the agenda or do roll call, we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's see. Do I have any volunteers? Oh, come on. All right, Callie, you're the volunteer today. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. All right.
Madam Vice Mayor, if I could recommend calling the roll prior to the agenda
That
approval?
sounds good to me.
Okay.
If you could call the roll then for both bodies, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Roll for Reno City Council, Breckus. Dewar.
Here.
Delgado. Weber. Jardin absent at this time. Sheevy absent at this time. Madam Vice Mayor, you do have a quorum of the Reno City Council.
All right, thank you.
Roll call for Planning Commission. Johnson.
Here.
Griffith.
Present.
Gower.
Here.
Hawkins.
Here.
Marshall. Absent at this time. Olivas.
Here.
Weisky.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you do have a quorum of the Reno City Planning Commission.
Thank you.
With that, our next item is approval, we're going to public comment at this time, Madam Vice Mayor.
Oh, okay. You want to do that before we approve the agenda?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Our
right.
first public commenter today is Jeff Church, followed by Sam Dene. Madam Vice Mayor, I apologize. We need to pause our meeting as the Reno City Council has lost quorum.
Okay.
Something I said?
Okay. We will go grab
We
one
will
of
be
those
back in just a second.
people. There she is. Okay. All right. So I think we're at first public comment.
We are
We got
at
them both.
first public comment. You are back to a quorum. Jeff Church, followed by Sam Dene.
And for the record, Ms. Jardone has joined us. Greetings. My name is Jeff Church. I run a website, renotaxrevolt.com. I've been out of town for a few months, so this is my first opportunity to address the city of Reno. Most of my issues currently deal with the city of Reno, not with the Planning Commission. But I just want to say in the future meetings, I'm going to be here more often. I'm going to discuss some different issues in more detail. One of the issues I will be discussing in the future is the OR Code $100,000 homeless survey. I have serious concerns with that, as well as the lack of any kind of a town hall meeting. The homeless situation, obviously, in Reno is getting out of control. We need to deal with it. I did serve on a nonprofit board previously for homeless, and I intend to weigh in on that issue in the future. The second issue I'm going to cover more in the future is the Downtown Reno Business Improvement District. I have some serious legal concerns to address on that. I did email many of you, as well as your city attorney. I think these issues need to be dealt with sooner than later, because if any of those issues are founded, it's going to be heck to try and go back and give people their assessment refunds, et cetera. Some of the issues that I have on the bid, number one, it's a 501c6 organization. It's not a government agency in that sense. It's a nonprofit advocacy. It's a political advocacy. It's not a charitable organization. This business improvement district is actually made up of mostly of residents. It's not made up of businesses, and I don't think it meets the IRS definition of a business improvement district to qualify for a 501c6 status. As an advocacy group, and it's right on their website, they intend to speak with one voice and to advocate. I draw your attention to the U.S. Supreme Court decision of 2018 known as Janus, which I did furnish to your city attorney, as well as a previous PG&E decision. You can't be forced to belong to an advocacy group that you may disagree with. Therefore, members of the bid should be able to opt out. The bid is most definitely subject to the Nevada open meeting law. I draw your attention to the Attorney General opinion on Mesquite, dated 2014. Couldn't be more clear. Also, taxpayers, I own property throughout Reno and Washoe County. I don't own any property in the BID district. I am being forced to subsidize the BID in various ways, including the police force, as well as the city of Reno paying assessments with general fund money. That is clearly illegal. There's plenty of case law on that. There's plenty of legal precedent on that taxpayers should not be forced to subsidize the BID. And in my remaining 30 seconds, I have many concerns with the police force staffing being determined by a 501c6 advocacy organization. The having a special private police force violates my rights down south, owning property under the 8th Amendment for equal protection under the law. Police forces should protect everybody equally. If they want to hire security guards, so be it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Madam Clerk?
Sam Dene, followed by Becky Jesse.
Sam DNA, that's hashtag Sam DNA, the heart and soul and the body and mind of Reno government. And right on cue, the beloved Hillary Sheevy, the mayor, arrives. Thank you very much. Now they have a total quorum. I'm an Air Force Academy graduate. I spent more time at these government podiums, and I've done more things to support the community than all of the people in this room added together, and all the people up at the dais there added together, philanthropically, all by myself with my giant brain and my big mouth. Anyway, nice smiley face over there. I'm here today to talk about one thing, and then another thing, and another thing. Hillary's, the mayor's beloved friend, Steve Sisolak, otherwise known as the governor, wants to rename the Reno airport. I'm an Air Force, I flew fighters and bombers, and I was an airline pilot for the greatest airline in history, Pan American, and we always like to have the airport named after where you're going. But if Sisolak demands that it be named, there's only one person to name the Reno airport after. That's Sam DNA Dene, the heart and soul and body and mind of Reno. I have more of aviation background than certainly Mr. Laxalt, and I like that guy. Put his name on a hospital or a government building or something like that. Not the airport has to be named after me. I've done more for the community than Laxalt ever dreamed of doing. So that's it, the Sam DNA. Does anybody, come on up here if you don't agree with that. Come on, you, please. I'm not challenging you. I love all you guys. But come on up here and say that's not right. We should name it after Mr. Hawkins. No. Anyway, or Ms. Dewar. No. Sam DNA, the heart and soul, body and mind, International Airport. Secondly, I am the driving force that brought medical marijuana to Reno. It eventually would have come, but I brought it here at least a year early. The city council kept dragging their feet after the state approved it. They kept dragging their feet. I finally came to the podium and said, it's legal, people are getting sick and dying, and the next week it was on the agenda. I came down here week after week, hunched them through it, and on 7/1/17, the new 420, 7/1/17 that I've trademarked, 7/1/17, it became legal. July 1st, 2017, thanks to Sam DNA Dene. Anybody challenge that? I never heard anybody come up here to the podium and talk about marijuana. At any rate, we got this deal going where Mr. Bobzian was taken away by Steve, and now there's an opening here. And I'm not telling you people what to do, but I'll tell you what the truth of the matter is. There is only one person qualified to fill that slot. All the rest of the people added together do not have the qualifications of that one person. And that one person is, guess who? Me. Anybody want to come and say no? I mean, there's a couple of people out there even running for the office. Come on up here and say no, Sam. Anyway, notwithstanding that, I don't think I'm going to put my hand in the ring. The person who should be getting that is the guy who was the challenger for mayor against the mighty Cashel in 2010, almost beat him, got 22,000 votes. He's a Marine Corps veteran, and most importantly, he's got Sam DNA on speed dial. Questions? Comments?
Thanks,
Applause? Anything?
Madam Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, too.
Our
So,
next
Madam
public
Mayor, I'm
comment.
handing the meeting back over to you, and we're on public comment.
Our next public comment is from Becky Jesse. Excuse me, she does not wish to speak, however, is concerned with pesticide-free neighborhoods.
I just want
She would like to speak.
Thank and congratulate you for doing the pesticide-free parks. I'm always really happy when I see one of those signs. And I'm hoping that in your zoning considerations that you will be considering pesticide-free neighborhoods. My partner and I actively grow food in the Midtown area, and we are advocates of fresh local food for everyone. And so we definitely have reason to want pesticide-free neighborhoods. If you can consider starting in Midtown, that's where we're at, and that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, with that, the next public comment that we have is reserved for the presentation. So our process would be now that you would hear from staff for the presentation. After council and planning commission makes their comments and questions, then we will move to public comment for the item.
And if I may, Madam Clerk, do we need to approve the agenda?
Thank you for that, Madam Vice Mayor. We do. We will go back to approval of the agenda. I'll have both bodies approve the agenda, please.
Okay, at this time, I'm going to ask the Reno City Council to give me a motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Sending it over to the Chair of the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Planning Commissioner is looking for an approval, motion to approve the agenda.
Commissioner Cruz, second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Motion carries. Back to you, Madam Mayor.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Thank you so much. At this time, we'll go to presentation. Welcome.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thanks for hosting the workshop today. We're excited to be here to really move the zoning code update forward into the real drafting process. So today's workshop is an important checkpoint before we really start diving in and drafting the new code. There are some recommendations that are in front of you that are in your packet regarding approaches to some of the key issues and the major changes that are recommended as we start drafting. So we're still really at that high level, kind of 30,000 foot today, because we want to say, are we going in the right direction before we start really drafting and making changes that we would vet with the community and you guys. So we're not diving into those details, but we're here to make sure that we're on the right track. We're not asking for any specific direction, but we're here to listen to your feedback, your reaction to these recommendations to help us move forward. Our goal would be that we could start drafting the code following this workshop. While we've booked a 4-hour block, we've really kind of planned this to be around 2 hours. So we're hoping to stick to that, but if the discussion goes a little bit farther, we have that wiggle room. But that would be our goal timeline-wise. The presentation is really broken into 3 parts because there's a lot in Title 18 that we will be updating. So we've broken it up in 3 different sections to kind of make it manageable during the meeting. So we've got zoning districts and uses, development and design standards, and administration and procedures. Following an overview presentation of those key issues in each one of those sections, we'll pause for the discussion period and hear your thoughts on those. You have your entire staff team who's working on the project up here to help answer kind of any questions about specific codes or how things kind of work in with our code now. And with that, we also have with us our consulting team with Clarion and Associates, who's really going to be leading this, but I want to introduce them to you as well. So we've got Matt Goebel. He's really going to be leading the charge for Clarion as we get into the drafting of this. And you guys probably all recognize Darcy White, who is with us during the master plan. So she is a part of this project team as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to kind of kick off the presentation and get us going.
All right, good job.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Madam Mayor, council members, commission members, it's good to see you all. Thank you all for your time and attention. It's a very important project for the city. We're excited to be here. So this is an important milestone. We really want to make sure that we get your feedback and make sure we're on the right track before we go too far down the road with drafting. So thank you for your time. We've tried to put together a presentation that is efficient and hopefully interesting and provocative, and we look forward to your comments. With that, just a little bit of background about us and about the project, just to give you some context. You have heard of Clarion Associates because we've been working with Reno for a while. We've been very pleased to be working with you, first of all, on the master plan process and now on the code update. This is what we do. We work around the country on plans and plan implementation. I think this is really important just to demonstrate to you that we bring a lot of good best practice knowledge from around the country. And so as we work through the drafting over the next year, we're going to be able to work with you all and with your staff to give you good examples on a lot of different issues about things that we've seen work well in other communities like Reno. So we're excited to be here. You're going to see primarily 3 of us during the course of this project. Myself, I'm a planner and attorney. I'm a director of the firm. I've been there about 22 years now. And this is what I do. I do codes around the country. Worked closely in Nevada just recently with TRPA down the road. So I've got a lot of experience in the area. also with the city of Henderson. Charlie Brennan worked on the master plan process. He will also be involved. He's not here today. He'll be involved with the project drafting. And then Darcy White, who many of you know already, will be assisting. And she's really providing an important linkage to the planning process to ensure that all those master plan ideas are carried forward in the new code. We'll be the primary workers on this. I've got a few slides now just to give you more background on the project and especially the purpose of this workshop today. Exactly kind of why we've asked you for this feedback. And I want to start with the overall purposes that you've identified for the project. The rewrite of Title 18, which is the Annexation and Land Development Code, it's being called Zoning Code Renovation. That's the branding that's been used for the public to describe the overall project. And you've identified these particular goals for the project, driven by community vision in the master plan, first of all. You spent a lot of time and resources and effort as part of that master plan process. And one of our real goals is to respect that process and respect all that feedback and make sure it's translated now into the new code. So that's very important for us. Easy to use. We're going to try to do everything we can to make sure that the new regulations for Reno are simple and clear and easy for people to understand, be they a property developer, be they a resident in a neighborhood, be they a staff member who's having to administer the code, be they an official who's having to make a recommendation or a decision. That's very important to us. Your current code is not bad in terms of being easy to use. It can be a lot better. We can make it shorter and simpler and prettier. And I'll talk more about that with some examples. And then finally, more predictable and transparent. You know, to the extent we can, we need to make sure the code gives you the tools to make clear, consistent, predictable decisions. And we'll talk more about those examples throughout this presentation. So those are high-level goals. Again, we're starting with the plan. The master plan is an important source of information. You're familiar with that, hopefully. It's got a lot of good detail for us in terms of the structure plan, in terms of the land use plan. It's really going to be our guiding principles, and we're always going to have it open on the desk as we're writing the new code moving forward. So just important to reinforce that as our policy foundation. Now, at the end of the master plan process, we developed a document. It's about a 60-page document called the Code Assessment Report, and it laid out a lot of key recommendations. I'm not going to go through all the text on this slide because we're going to go through some of these topics in more detail. But the point here is just to illustrate that we have got a strong identification already produced as part of the master plan process about where we need to go. Really, the purpose of today is to try to distill down a lot of these key ideas and make sure that we're on the right track. So in terms of process, the overall process did kick off at the end of the master plan, and it's really been in two phases. Phase one was the staff working very hard to take that code assessment report that I mentioned and present it to the community, to really take it out to a lot of different stakeholder groups, to get feedback on what was on additional detail, or just to get confirmation that we were on the right track. They did a survey that was posted online. They got a lot of good feedback on that survey. They had open houses. They did updates for both the City Council and the Planning Commission. So a lot of work was already done in what we're calling phase one to get confirmation that we're on the right track. Now we're moving into phase two, which is actually the writing of the code. And we're here in part one of phase two, which is this code direction workshop. Very quickly after that, we're going to pivot into the actual drafting of the code, which is under the numeral 2 there that you see. We're going to break it down into 3 parts. It's hard, you can't just write an entire code at one time. We break it down so that it's manageable. It's going to be kind of thematically related sets of material. The first piece is going to be zoning districts and uses. The residential districts, the mixed-use districts, et cetera, that the city of Reno is divided into, and the different types of land uses that are allowed within those districts. The next part is going to be the development and the design standards. This is where we get at the issues of quality. This is the issues of how good does the building have to be in terms of its design? How good does the landscaping have to be? What types of sensitive site features have to be protected? All those things are covered in part 2. And then finally, administration and procedures. Who makes what decisions? What are the responsibilities of the city council in approving, say, a rezoning? What are the responsibilities of the planning commission in administering the system overall? So that's the overall process that we'll break the topics down by. You will see us for each one of those topics. We'll come back and do public meetings on each of those pieces. Then we'll put it all together at the end. And you'll hear more about the adoption process later on. But overall, the drafting of the code itself is going to take about a year. And we're hoping to get a full draft in place that's all consolidated and ready for community to review in early 2020. Now, we're having detailed discussions about the calendar right now with the staff, and we're trying to shave some of that time off and get it done even faster. But just rest assured, we've gotten that direction that we need to move this along as quickly as we can. So that's the overall scope and timeline and the steps that we're going to walk through. Now, we get into the purpose of today's workshop. This is why we've asked you all here. We really just want to provide another check on the major issues that are going to be addressed in this project to make sure that we're on the right track, to give you all an opportunity to just let us know. What are your priorities? Have we missed anything? Do you disagree with anything that you hear today? Do you think we're on the right track? That's really all we're asking for. We're going to go through each of those 3 focus areas that I mentioned: zoning districts and land uses, development and design, administration and procedures. We've got a few slides on each of those topics just to give you a high-level discussion of where we are. You've got a code direction memo that we've prepared that goes through those in even more detail than I've got in these slides. That's a scaled-back version of that code assessment report. So we've got a lot of this information that's already been prepared as background. We're going to go through each topic, and then we're going to pause and turn it back to you all for your discussion and feedback. For each one, we're simply asking for the council and the planning commission to either confirm the direction or provide additional feedback. That's why we're here.
Can I ask one question at this point? Sorry to interrupt your flow. I just wondered, things that are already underway, you know, we have a number of ordinance development processes that have been underway, whether it's sewer, strip clubs, or this or that. Do those continue on their own path, or are you wanting to fold all that in, or what? How does it get dealt with?
I think that's a great question, and we always face this issue of there's always things in the pipeline as a community does a project like this. We're going to have to work with your staff on each one of those individually, and they're all going to probably have a different answer.
Okay.
Some of them potentially get folded into the code. Some of them will stay separate altogether.
Yeah.
But we're aware that those things are underway.
To some of your specific questions, sewer is a separate process that's occurring outside of this. The adult business ordinance is the same thing, separate process outside of this one.
Okay.
I think those were the 2 that you
I
specifically
mentioned those, but I think there's even a couple others that we've
Yeah, there
started.
probably is, but I just wanted to address those.
Okay, thanks.
Madam Mayor, I have a question also about process.
Yeah, go right ahead.
And, there's a lot of people here today, more than I would have thought, and thank you everyone for showing up. I think there's one piece of the process that wasn't discussed, and that's that staff has assembled a technical working group, which I see, and I asked to know when all those meetings were because I missed the first couple, and it's 8 a.m. on the 19th, and I'd just like to understand who's been invited to those, confirm that they're public open meetings, and it gets, I think a lot of, this gets very technical very quick, and having been through this before, there's people who may show up for one set of ordinances and never want to come up again, but I just think that this technical group should be presented in concept and let people know they are invited, even though, it may not have been appointed by us. So can you answer that?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we have formed a technical working group made up of practitioners of the code in our community who use it on a regular basis. So our technical users, those meetings, so we've invited different professional organizations to select somebody to serve on that committee to help provide feedback. Those meetings are open to the public. So at this point, we've started scheduling monthly meetings. I think it's the third Tuesday of the month at 8 a.m. here at City Hall. The information about those meetings is posted on our website. And you can, if you go to reno.gov/community development, there's a link to zoning code renovation, and it has all that information on
Okay,
there. Yeah.
thank you.
So we encourage everybody to attend.
Thank you.
I was looking for the slide that actually had the expectations that we laid out for the committee. I just wanted to give you the kind of high-level headings, but it's attend meetings, review draft code revisions, provide valuable input, engage in productive discussion, advocate for the process. I would just say, as context, we do a lot of codes. It's very hard to get this level of attendance at an early meeting on a code project, so I'm really pleased that you've got so many folks in the audience today. We often don't see that, and so we often recommend putting together some kind of a stakeholder committee that really can devote the time and energy to kind of walk through the process with us and provide that detailed feedback. I suspect we're going to have both in Reno. We'll have that technical committee, but we'll also have a really robust public voice. So that's great. We're excited. Any other questions on process or thoughts on process before we move into substance.
I don't think the council does have a commission.
Planning commissioners, any questions? Okay, I'm getting a lot of shaking of the head, so.
One thing
we're
I'm
good.
just going to ask you guys is sort of, so this is like kind of open dialogue and not so structured like a council meeting, that just go ahead and jump in when you have a question. If you'd like them to wait, then let me know and then we'll just do that process. But I want everyone to be able to sort of have this conversation.
That sounds great. If there's something on a slide that needs clarification immediately, please let me know. But we also have factored in a question slide at the end of each kind of component of the substance. That's a really good time for you all to just kind of brainstorm and provide general feedback.
Okay, great.
So, zoning districts and land uses. I mean, this is the heart of zoning for a lot of people. This is the way that a community is divided into districts and what you can build on your site, what type of use you can engage in. I just wanted to give you a couple of introductory slides here. One of the things that we're really going to focus on in this project is making the code more user-friendly. That means more illustrations, more summary tables, a shorter document ideally. If you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you see a couple of screenshots of the current Reno code, and it's pretty text-heavy. It does have some summary tables like you see there on the right. There's in the middle of the right-hand picture from the Reno code, there's a table of dimensional standards for a zoning district. What you see on the far right of the slide, however, is where we're going. And this is an example of another code that we've done recently for another community. But it's a one-page summary description of a sample residential district. And it's got a purpose statement. It's got a clear summary of the dimensional standards that apply in that district. And then it's got an illustration of typical development that you would see there. And so it's an easier one-stop shop to give the community just a general visual sense of the type of development you'll see in each district. And so from a user-friendliness perspective, this is where we're going in terms of simplifying and making the code easier to use. The same concept is going to apply to the uses in the Reno code. Now, on the left-hand side is a snapshot of your current code, and you can see you've got a use table in place. That's great. We work in a lot of codes where they still just have these long laundry lists of uses that are alphabetically listed. They're not organized at all. You are not starting from scratch, but we can make it better. And on the right-hand side is an example, again, from another code that we've done. We're going to be marching very methodically and with a very detailed eye through your use lists to make sure, are the appropriate uses allowed within each district, based on the master plan and based on the feedback that we get from you all. Are the uses appropriately defined? You've got some vague definitions and you've got some missing use definitions right now. Are there potential opportunities to collapse use types that are similar and have similar land use impacts? Or can we get rid of some uses that are obsolete? We'll just be working through all that in a very methodical way to update that use table. So hopefully it's going to be shorter in the new code. We oftentimes are able to collapse and consolidate uses and strip away, dozens by replacing very specific use types with more general use categories. So you'll hear a lot more about this when we get into the next piece of the code, but that's a sense of where we're going. So those are two introductory slides. Now let's get into the substance, and Darcy's going to start off, but we're going to talk about the high-level themes that we're going to be implementing through each of these components, starting with the mixed-use districts, which is one of the more, I would say, more complex parts of the current Reno system.
Thanks, Matt. So we spent a lot of time talking about the mixed-use districts as part of the master plan process, and this is really kind of off point. And so in your current code, you have one mixed-use space. We were talking about the total count earlier today, and we know it's in the ballpark of between 15 and 20 overlay districts that are in place now to address the different district and center plans that have since been consolidated as part of the master plan process. And so as we get into the code update, this is where we start to translate some of those ideas that were discussed through the master plan process into the new districts. And so this was an area we heard from stakeholders in the community. There was a lot of confusion. It's more complicated than it needs to be. So this has been a goal that the city's had for, long before the master plan process started, but this is something we were able to kind of move forward through that process. And so a couple things to clarify, I think, through that process is that the foundation for the mixed-use districts, the origin of those, which was the Truckee Meadows Regional Plan, we're carrying forward those concepts. This is still very much about implementing those ideas, but they've been tailored more closely to Reno through the master plan process. So you may recall we set up a couple of tiers. So now we have urban versus suburban districts. So you've got different areas that relate to the Todd corridors, which was their original purpose, but we're trying to focus infill in more strategic locations. And so the code will really help us define those locations further to carry forward the master plan. So the goal here is really to make it easier to use, kind of continuing on Matt's theme, but also to make it easier to administer. So I think if someone came into the community cold and tried to kind of work through that set of overlay districts, it's pretty complicated, even if you are familiar with the general concept. So so that's the overall intent. And you've got a more detailed table in the memo that you were provided, but I think just to kind of run through some of the big changes. Essentially what we've tried to do, this ties back to both the structure plan at some level in the master plan as well as the land use plan. So we're carrying forward some of those big ideas. The base district will kind of be the foundation, the mixed use district, but we will have unique mixed use districts for different types of mixed use in the community. I think one of the things that we found and we heard is that mixed use and the intensity of it, the types of uses you're trying to achieve, there's a lot of different things happening in different locations, and so this is a way to carry forward those concepts as well as to implement some of the work that's been done recently, for example, in downtown. And so the downtown plan was happening as we were going through the master plan process. This will help carry forward some of the sub-districts that came out of that process through unique standards. We will have separate districts for both the urban and suburban land use categories. One of the things that came up we've had some questions so far in terms of the suburban mixed use. This particular proposed district would consolidate the arterial commercial as well as the community commercial. And there's some questions about, how exactly would that work? There's some differences there. I think one of the important things to note is that those districts now actually do allow for a mix of uses. So again, this is about clarifying exactly what you're trying to achieve and making sure you've got the right tool in place to do that. And so if you think about the progression of these districts, downtown is going to be the most intense area of the community, and then you're kind of tapering down from there into some more strategic districts. We are proposing a separate mixed-use district for the airport area, and this was, again, something that came out of our discussions with the Airport Authority, that they really have some unique needs in terms of the types of mixed use that they're really trying to accomplish in their facilities. And so that's something that would be a standalone district. And then the neighborhood center district, this was something that was really, you have a foundation for this in your code now, but this would really build on what we heard from the community in terms of reinforcing the idea and the desire for more walkable mixed-use districts. So that's sort of something where you're kind of building on what you have versus starting from scratch. So a lot to cover there. And then another big theme we wanted to talk about in terms of the districts and uses is the idea of a neighborhood overlay. And there's a couple different things happening here. I think one of the things we did as part of the master plan process was saw an opportunity to expand a lot of the specialized policies that had applied through the neighborhood plan process more broadly across the city. So just because a community or a neighborhood doesn't have a neighborhood plan in place, for example, they have some of the same challenges, and we want to make sure that the quality applies more broadly throughout the city. So we established the design principles. We spent a lot of time talking about, the differences between central neighborhoods versus foothill or outer neighborhoods. So we've got that foundation in the plan. And so the goal here is to codify those design principles as standards that would apply more broadly across the city. So that's kind of step one of this process. But we are proposing to establish a new neighborhood overlay that would kind of give you a supplemental set of tools where it's needed. And I think that's the caveat, is that is intended to be a fairly strategic tool. And whether or not neighborhood overlay is the right name or not. I think there's been a lot of discussion about that so far and probably will continue to be. That's not set in stone. It's meant to be a tool to address some of the really unique situations that you have in the community. So a couple examples from the plan. We talked about the Pounding District. We talked about the Newlands District, where you have situations where there are unique circumstances beyond those ideas that you would want to apply citywide. So just to kind of put it into context, it may be that you want to use your transition standards citywide. Those are issues we're going to have regardless of which corridor you're on, where you have neighborhoods that abut those corridors. So making sure that the density transition happens citywide. However, you may have situations where there are unique character features in Pounding or Newlands where you want to have a little extra layer of protection. And so I think the goal there is to provide that opportunity, but recognize that the first priority should be to evaluate whether there's a way, whether the types of issues that are need to be addressed are relevant citywide. And so trying to keep that application high level as much as you can, but you do have a way to kind of address some of those unique circumstances if you need to.
All right, I'll take it from here. You can see already that the districts and uses piece of the puzzle here is the meatiest part of the code update. There's some really big issues here. We just have a couple more big ideas to get out for you before we open it up for discussion. PUDs, planned unit developments. So this is a type of district. These have been used extensively in Reno over the years, and PUDs are great in that they provide the ability to, consider a lot of flexibility for unique projects and to really tailor the regulations to a particular type of project. However, when you see a community that's using PUDs all the time or extensively, that's often to us the sign of a broken code. That means that the fundamental tools in your code, the districts that you have, the development standards, they are not adequate to meet your needs in some way, to give you the flexibility that you need or to give you the high level of quality that you're expecting. And so you're negotiating outside the code altogether. You're doing a separate code. So again, that's great in terms of your ability to negotiate and achieve a high level of quality for that project is great. But that ultimately means that each one of those PUDs is a separate mini zoning code that has to be administered in addition to the base code. And Reno, just like a lot of other communities around the country, realizes that's not a sustainable planning model. You don't have the resources to administer all those different codes as well as your foundation code moving forward. And so one of our goals here with the project is to try to just shrink the box when you need to go to that PUD tool. We're not taking PUDs altogether away. You're still going to need to negotiate PUDs in the future, but we'd like to give you a better overall toolbox so you don't need to do them as much. And then when you do them, we want to address these issues on the slide to make the PUD process get you a better quality product. The new bullets, I'll read these because they're all important. Establish a two-step PUD approval process. Preliminary approval of concept plan followed by formal approval. We can talk more about this, but the idea is that before someone gets so far down the road and has to spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on detailed plans and studies for a particular project, they need you all to say, you're on the right track. We like this idea. We like the overall concept of where you're going. We're going to bless that concept before you get too far down the road. Now, the specific line between concept and the actual later documents is to be discussed. And that's something that's different in every community. They draw that line differently between concept plan requirements and later. But the idea that you get an early upfront approval on the concept is what we're trying to stress here. What's the overall mix of uses that's being proposed? What's the general size? What's the general density amounts? What's the general circulation pattern? Some of those high-level things you approve up front. Then you get into the details like landscaping later. Establish clear public benefit requirements. PUDs were originally created as an incentive. Somebody gets to do a PUD, you're giving them the opportunity to step outside the code. They should be providing a public benefit in exchange for that flexibility. The code should clearly articulate the types of public benefits that you're expecting to see, be it more open space, or be it more affordable housing, or be it higher design quality. You don't have to specify those things with mathematical certitude in the code, but you need to authorize the city to say, this is what we're looking for in exchange for this flexibility. Require a fiscal impact analysis. You know, the code should clearly say, we need to require you to tell us, you know, how this is going to pencil out and what the numbers are. Require the use of master plan land uses. The idea there is now that when you're negotiating a new PUD, start with the master plan as your foundation. Don't just create something new from scratch with new terminology, a whole new vocabulary. You need to start with the land use concepts that the city has already embraced as part of the master plan, and then say how you're going to deviate from that. Because right now you're allowing a complete kind of free form every time. Require a greater mix of housing types. This is something that's emphasized in the master plan as well. You know, you've said if you're going to do this type of PUD development, we want to see the master plan ideas of greater mixes of housing implemented. And then finally, establish a process to convert SPDs, the special planning districts, and PUDs to base zoning. The idea here is that you might have some older agreements that are out there that potentially might want to convert to the new districts in the code. We're giving you a whole new toolbox here. There could be a situation where a PUD was developed just for a particular limited use list or a particular situation that is addressed by the new standards that we create. There could be incentives to clean up your zoning map, to clean up those old entitlements and have them just convert to base zoning. I'm not just going to say that you can do that for every PUD that's out there, but it could be that there are some that you are able to clean up your zoning map by converting them to base zoning. So a lot of ideas there. Again, we're not proposing taking away PUD tool. You need that tool, but we can make it better. And overall, the better code is going to minimize the use of this tool. This one is fast. This is the final slide for this, but there are many other zoning districts in Reno that we haven't talked about here on these slides. They're covered in the memo. They're covered in the assessment report. We're going to do a lot of cleanup to them. We're going to relook at the purpose statements for all those districts and make sure that they're implementing the master plan appropriately. We're going to look at all the uses allowed within those districts and see if there's any tailoring that needs to be done based on the master plan or other feedback. Just in terms of nomenclature, we can do a lot of cleanup of the district names and the abbreviations to make it a little bit more standardized and clean. So we're not going to get into those weeds in this presentation, but just rest assured there's a lot of other things, and we can answer questions about those, but there's other cleanup that we're anticipating and we'll be doing as part of this part of the project. So that's a lot. And we've highlighted the pieces in this element of the code update that we thought were the most important. But this is our first opportunity to just pause and to step back and say, are we on the right track? Do you have any comments about any of these big ideas or small ideas that we've laid out on these prior slides? I think with that, Madam Mayor, I'll turn it back to you to facilitate this conversation.
I guess at this time, any questions from council members? Councilmember Breckus.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. Here's just a few comments I have. The overlay concept for neighborhoods, I did bring up in my briefing, you know, is it the term a neighborhood proper? I think when you go into an existing area, you're going to call it a neighborhood, but when you're going into a growth area or an incorporated mixed area with growth potential, you need to call it an area plan of some sort, and then maybe have some criteria for areas. And I'll just give an example. When the city, through the regional planning of 2005, 2006 settlement, took a large chunk of Verdi into annexation, the county's template of the Verdi area plan was there, and we should have gone in with the county collectively and redone the Verdi area plan as a city document in my view, and I advocated for that when I came on, and but you know, we were kind of in the downturn, and then you know, the growth really hit us fast when we went to the master plan. And that's another point, is when you said a lot of times you've got doing PUDs is a you know, kind of reflection of a broken code. We do have a broken code, it's outdated and so on, but I think it's also a reflection of more your master planning and your area planning. And I think that's more the Reno case in my view, is that we did a lot of annexations, pre-annexations, and then we did not go through the annexations that we inherited through our annexation transition table into plans. And then we skipped that intermediate step of planning, most critically planning for infrastructure, and then went very developer driven with them coming through for PUD requests. So I think we need to remember that. I have a few other comments on this, and I'll hold and let it go around one more time, and then I'll bring up some of my other comments.
All right, thank you. Vice Mayor Dewar.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing. I would love to do this like next week, because we see these issues that you have identified. And I mean, this was a kind of a process where you interviewed us and said, what challenges are you having? And these are the kind of challenges that we're having. I mean, I really like the idea on the PUDs of having a base case be the base zoning, and then they identify deviations and the why. Oh, you want a different kind of fence, like 6 feet instead of 4, or something that's throughout the city? Why? You know, putting the burden on them to say why they have to deviate. And I really like that, because then we all can understand the base code. But this has been very hard to read through these giant PUDs and understand what this new development's going to look like and what's different and what's the same. You know, and then within PUDs, a lot of times they have these charts, and there will be a whole table of uses, such as a church or a school or a cell phone tower or something. And each use has a different level of permitting that goes with it. And, you know, some require special use permits, some are permitted by right, you know, some have to go to the council, some get to go to the staff, you know. If it's a certain size, it does something else. And what I become nervous of is looking at this PDs. I realize that I am not looking at these tables close enough, because I've already seen 10, 15 years later after some of these PUDs where suddenly a thing pops up and, oh yeah, it was approved back in 2005. You know, none of us were even here, and we don't get a conversation piece on that, a very important thing to the community. So I think that is very, very, very helpful. I really like this two-step idea of the PUD, where you'd have a concept plan and a detail plan. I worked at another agency once, and they had exactly called it that. They called it the conceptual plan and then the detail plan. My question back to you is, if we approve a concept plan, does that infer or imply that we're going to improve the detail plan? You know, how much weight does the concept plan carry? So I don't know if you want to respond or just think about that for later.
Well, it's an important question. I mean, to be determined.
Okay.
Things change, you know, economies change, and people are going to want to change those concept plans. And so one of the things we'll have to talk with you about is, to what extent can people go through and change that concept plan before delivering final documents? And
Okay.
you're probably going to need to establish some thresholds and distinguish major versus minor changes.
And when you have to come back and
When you-
start again.
Exactly, yeah.
And then another thing is that we see, like, in my area, I have a lot of these PUDs in my ward, and a lot of the people have come back 5, 6, 7 times to amend the PUD. And then the PUDs last forever, and that's been a real challenge, because it really doesn't reflect changing realities, such as this mix that you spoke of, mix of housing types, or what might have been a city benefit 20 years ago, even if we had this in place, might not be the same kind of benefit that we're looking for today. Maybe then it was a park, maybe now it's a bike lanes, you know, or trail and connectivity, or maybe back then it was, you know, 2 ways in and out, and that's important too, but now we want to see sustainability or community solar, or, you know, we want to see that in every PUD or something. I mean, so that has been my biggest frustration, is that the PUDs, there's no expiration date. And so I guess that would be a question I put back to you too, is, do they ever expire? I mean, most things I know expire. Like, it's not forever. And maybe these things have a 20-year expiration and then a renewal, and I'm not 100% sure of how we have it set up exactly right now, but I think that's pretty long in our fast-changing society, you know, so.
I would agree, and I would say in many states where we work, a best practice is to have an expiration date on PUDs, and recognizing that circumstances change, and a deal that was negotiated by this council in 2019 may not really be appropriate 20 years from now
Right.
without modifications. We'll need to talk with your city attorney and make sure everything we do is consistent with NRS, obviously, but I understand the concept. We've seen it work.
And then lastly, I'll just say this. You made a statement about incentives to clean up your map, and I don't know what we can offer, but I really like that. Bringing a PUD or anything into conformance with a more base code and giving up some odd things, whether it's the width of a street is laid out as 52 feet instead of 55, when all the streets in Reno are supposed to be 55, or something like that, or having 4 feet sidewalks when really we want wider sidewalks, you know, probably 5 feet or more, you know, so people can walk side by side and push the, you know, the carriage or whatever. I mean, that's been a real issue, is the sidewalks are pretty narrow. Or another example would be some of our PUDs have the sidewalks set back from the street, and some have the sidewalks set right on the street. And those are pretty scary to me because we have some pretty high speeds on the arterials. And the people that are walking or having their kids or teaching their kid to bike ride, are very fearful. And so I would love to see some more consistency with that kind of thing. I mean, I understand a PUD set up, like maybe they only have this much land and they have to have the sidewalk right up to the street. But I would love to see those kind of principles, more adhered to. So, thank you.
All right, Councilwoman Jordan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the work you guys have put in to this point. I know that our master plan took 20 years to get in place, and this is a companion documents that will require just as much effort and hopefully won't take 20 years. Hopefully we'll get there because it is critically important. I did want to say I appreciate the comments about simplicity and making it so the users can understand it on the front end, what's expected of them, because that is the message that I hear consistently is we'll do what you want us to. We just need to know what you want. And sometimes when it comes to the council, that can change. And they don't know what they're coming into, and they've spent money on engineers and architects, and then only to come to our body and have us change up what we were expecting, and they have to go back to the drawing board. So, and that's not just developers, that's anybody that is looking at our code, trying to figure out what do they want? I want to meet what they want, and that sort of thing. So I appreciate it. The meetings that you've had to this point, how many have you had?
On the code itself, not that many. We're really just getting started. We've had a kickoff meeting with the technical committee. The staff has had a number of open houses and other workshops on phase one just to get general feedback on the assessment report. But we're really just getting going on the code drafting. So nothing on actual draft text yet.
Okay. That's very helpful. Appreciate all the help so far.
All right, Planning Commission, any questions?
Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Weisky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is in regards to timelines. Without getting specific to timelines, are you going to bring these drafts back to us one at a time based upon each of your bullet points and areas of remodel, if you will, rewrite, or are you going to bring it back as a full document?
It's the former, and I don't want to get into specifics of the timeline without checking with staff, but the idea is that we roll these out incrementally. So with each of these big ideas, you'll see a partial draft, and then you'll see the whole thing again put together at the end.
That's good, because that was going to be my suggestion, because it might be easier for us to not only dissect it, but digest it, and then provide better quality input back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Weisky. Additional questions? Commissioner Hawkins?
Kind of curious, this workshop going to take care of planning by amendment? It seems like a lot of development comes in front of us, and they either want a master plan amendment, they want a zone amendment, zone change. How can we get away from doing just that? I mean, we have a brand-new master plan, and every time we turn around, somebody wants to change it by amendment. We can't be planning by doing that.
I could take a stab at that, not from the, well, I could take a stab at that. I think one of the things that we call for, and I haven't gotten to it yet, but we talk about needing to change the process for amendments to entitlements. So if somebody gets an SUP, can they come in and can they propose changes to that down the road? That always happens. I mean, situations always change. You can't ever lock those in and say they're permanent. I think one of the goals that we need to try to pursue is to help you identify the most efficient process for dealing with those amendments, and to separate out the big ones from the small ones, and to figure out which ones are really not a big deal and could be handled by your professional planning staff without too much time and effort, and which ones really do have an impact on the community and should come back to you all, either the Planning Commission or the council as appropriate. So we'll be thinking through that process. I can't promise that we're going to stop the process of amendments moving forward. I think that's just always a factor of kind of changing life and conditions and economies and things, but we can help you manage that process, I think, more efficiently moving
Thank you, Commissioner Hawkins. Commissioner Marshall?
I just wanted to have you guys think a little bit about the neighborhood overlay, as it's called, and the tension between, while it might be flexible for the neighborhood to, or the city to adopt neighborhood plans, it might tie the city's hands when thinking about these more citywide policies that need to implement the new master plan. And so how, I'd be interested in a pretty robust discussion on, how that would not result in further handcuffing implementation of master plan policies citywide.
That's a great question. And we will have more discussions about that down the road in detail, but I wanted to just hit an important point about these conservation districts. And I guess I'll talk about it from a drafting perspective. They're not going to be the first thing that we draft. The first thing that we focus on is identifying the overall better toolbox for Reno that is consistent with the master plan. That's the overall citywide design standards and development standards. It's the overall citywide districts. We need to get that foundation in place first. Only then would we come back and augment those citywide standards with something specific to particular neighborhoods. The goal of this neighborhood overlay tool is it's an add-on. It comes back later. It's just if we didn't get something with the overall citywide set of tools. But I want the box to be fairly small and constrained for these neighborhood tools, because I do see the potential for them to become kind of a tool for NIMBYism if you let them get too out of control. They really need to stay in a small box. So we need to get the foundation right, and then we'll come back and work with you to build on in targeted areas where we need to. I was telling the staff about experiences elsewhere with conservation districts. Dallas has been using these for a long time. And Dallas has got a system where they've boiled down the regulations in these conservation districts to just roughly a page for each one of these 20-plus districts. They've identified just a few character-defining features in each one of those districts that's worthy of regulating. Everything else is covered by the base zoning in those districts. That's the way their system has evolved. Now, the beauty of the conservation tool is that every city adopts it a little bit differently. You've got a lot of flexibility, a lot of different models about how you pull this forward, so we can bring all those together. But it's just an add-on, and it's intended to be small on top of citywide standards.
Thank you. The other issue, and also raised by Councilmember Dewar, is this notion for PUDs between conceptual approval and the actual final approval process. And admittedly, not seeing a huge number of PUDs, it really is useful to see the detail in order to understand some of the conceptual approaches, particularly. I would like to hear more about what really are those items in the conceptual plan that drive the important decisions. Obviously, it doesn't have to be all design details, but those things that are really important that you would see in unfortunately, a binder full of material, but really drive the critical decisions as to what's in the PUD and what deviations or what is the housing mix or, those things. I very much encourage that kind of thinking of strategic thinking of what is it for decision makers, what do they really need to focus on in terms of ultimate approval of the PUD, so we don't get in a situation where, there's conceptual approval and then all of a sudden there's a big sea change when you get to the final approval. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. Just one comment before I hand it back. I definitely appreciate the direction you're going here, and Darcy, thank you for bringing up the comment in terms of the modification of some of the base zone districts. I think the one thing that jumps out at us sometimes when we see the combination of, say, an AC and a CC being combined into one, and recognizing that there are actually differences in those two. So while appropriate, I think for moving forward as you're putting some of these things together, especially for coming back to this body, both of these bodies, if we can be very specific in terms of, what are the, there's differences right now. This is what we're deciding to move forward with, because certainly those are things like, sign size, building height. Those are the ones that seem to be the biggest stumbling blocks. So I like the approach that you're taking with this. I think as you move forward, just being very specific as to how some of those things are being combined would be helpful. So if there's nothing else from the Planning Commission, I'll turn it back, I guess, to you guys for the next portion of the presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Bill Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. For the record, Bill Thomas, Assistant City Manager. So just to get some clarity on the PUD from the staff standpoint, I think what we're talking about is the way it works right now is the private individual decides to use that tool.
Build it from the
And
bottom
once
up.
we have the tool, then we talk about how they're using it and what it is. Our thought on this is before somebody gets to use the PUD tool, we have a conversation, is this the right project
Yeah.
for the right reason to use the tool? So I would see it not so much as a pre-approval of some colored map on how the land uses are done, but really why? Why do you want to use the PUD? And so then we would have a decision as the city to say, yeah, that's the right tool. Now the next phase would be to go into the details of it. So we don't get in that issue of, well, we pre-approved it the first time, so we can't really change it the second. It would be more really, is this the right tool?
Yeah. Okay, good point.
Look, quick follow-up.
Councilwoman,
wanna hold
go
up?
ahead. Yeah, let's hold off and
Okay.
then we'll come back to it. And then I'm going to ask council to try to stick to 3 minutes. Okay, go right ahead.
All right, topic 2.
Well, I'm sorry, I
Oh, you
cut
wanna
myself
go
off
back for-
previously,
okay.
and I wanted to bring up a few points. In outlook that I'm operating from, PUDs are in growth areas, and whether it's this conceptual discussion on that particular or this area plan, where the issues of timing, infrastructure, availability, and provided services, because these PUDs have growth demands, and in that case, the infrastructure and the serviceability is almost more critical. So maybe the conceptual isn't just on that parcel, it's on, we've done an area plan, and within that, we see outline an area for PUD. A few other comments I just want to make briefly is, Reno's always done interesting with their residential, SF9, SF15, and you're talking about changing those on a density calculation. I would go all the way and call it R4, R3, or, maybe merge the SF4 and the MF14 because they calc out to the same density. I think that's one. You discuss gaming quite a bit, and I think we are going to need a pointed discussion on gaming. It's unique to Reno's codes, the way we do it. I think sometimes the gaming overlay is allowed to let land hang out there forever on the gaming hope that it's coming, and I think it clogs up land use. And so through some process of, is an existing gaming license there? Is gaming entitled there? Let's have that conversation and look at that map, and I hope we'll spend the time there. I think we can be more innovative with the PF zoning district. We're doing some gymnastics at the Planning Commission and the City Council right now to amend our public meals facilities, which is a clunky use and definition. And if we had a better public facilities role to just put every public facilities in a special use permit when it's going to be hitting a public conversation anyway, how much we fund this meal provider or whatever, I think it's a better tool, and I think we're kind of clogging the system up. And two other points is, one, I am concerned that we don't have a distribution warehouse district. Distribution warehouses, when they size above 100,000, 200, and we see 200,000, I think we've seen a 400,000 million. They need to be standalone districts. They cannot be dropped into the IB and the IC. In my worldview, the way they connect up, particularly up in Ward 4, residential and so on, I think. So I would love your analysis on distribution warehouse in a metro area, how you get them in, because we're still getting them, and we're getting them in a big size. And my last point is, you're calling urban transition 40, UT 40, and that's a continuation. And I know when the Planning Commission talked about, I think it was Stonegate, said, well, it's been annexed, it's urban transition 40. By annexation, it should go to suburbanization. Some of the conversation of the Planning Commission was there, and I can understand that presumption, but I think Reno needs to start thinking, if we are going to put a rural reserve district in, you know what I'm saying? The concept of naming a district urban transition, means it's, ranch land, the hills, they're going, transitioning somewhere? Or is Reno going to take a conscious step and say, we're going to hold things in rural reserve, and if you annex in, don't be surprised if you're held to rural reserve, because we want to ring ourselves. That gets into what the county's doing, what the regional plan's doing, but I would like it for you to have that concept kind of fleshed out for us also. So, thank you.
Well, I'll just say my comment too, because that was part of my comment, was I was looking for something in that category, rural reserve, open space, where it really is that thing. And it would take a lot to change it. And I wondered if we were going to change any of the zoning that was done in the new master plan. Like when you're looking at the code, are you going to aggregate some of these things or disaggregate some of them? That was a question I had. And then finally, I just wanted to give another pitch for this neighborhood overlay. So I live in one of the few remaining areas that has a neighborhood plan. And I think that to make amazing towns is set up with amazing neighborhoods, unique neighborhoods, distinct neighborhoods. I want to move to the, Newlands neighborhood, the Midtown neighborhood, the Greenfield neighborhood, the Moana Pool neighborhood, or whatever it's going to be called. But I think that, I understand what you're saying. Everything should be base and go off from there. But I don't think that the go off from there means more restrictive. It could be less restrictive, okay, because of the nature of that place, is already, like I live in an area that doesn't have sidewalks, for example. I don't want to think they would have to go redo the whole city, put in sidewalks, or say specifically, I think it should be okay. It makes it unique and different and not necessarily bad. So I've already recommended it for some other neighborhoods, and also take Newlands, for example. I don't think it has to be that big. My neighborhood plan is maybe, I don't know how big, but it's only, let's say, 100 homes and 100 townhomes and a couple commercial. It's not that big. It's not like all of Newlands. And I think you could have some subsets that could work for that area. So I don't think about size to make it more workable, maybe. Thank you.
Right ahead.
That's a good point on the overlays. We should have clarified that. The neighborhood districts can go up or down.
Okay.
They don't just have to add things. They can potentially provide additional relief. So
Okay,
keep
cool.
that in mind. Next topic, development and design standards. This one might actually go a little bit faster. We don't have as many details for you in this presentation, but again, this is the quality issues. This is how do you protect the site, protect the sensitive site features like the streams or riparian areas. How do you set how do you lay out the overall site design? How do you build the building? How do you put in operational features like lighting or things like that? Again, I've got a couple of just introductory slides to show you where we're going. You do have a lot of this, you've got a lot of detailed development standards in your current code. A lot of our work here is not going to be starting from scratch like we do in many communities. It's going to be taking what you've got and taking it to the next level, taking a first or a second generation approach and moving it even further. So we've definitely got a strong foundation to work with. Just wanted to show you, we'll be trying to illustrate this part of the code in particular with a lot more standards. This is just your landscaping part of the code, and here's just some examples of landscaping standards from another code that we did recently. There are some overall themes, some overall goals that we're going to try to get at through this part of the project that I wanted to emphasize right up front. First of all, going back to my original point, implement the master plan. You've got chapter 3. You've got all these very thoughtful design standards focused on kind of areas of the city that you've already identified in the master plan. That is our working document. We need to make sure that all those design principles are implemented. So every topic that I get to on the next slide, we have to go back and look at that through the lens of the master plan. What does it say about updating those standards? Distinguish greenfield from infill development. A Walgreens that goes in on a new greenfield site potentially is going to be very different from one that comes in just down the street here in the downtown. There's different development standards. You might be buffering your parking differently. You might be there's a whole kind of range of standards that might be differently in a greenfield context versus an infill context. You already have good tools in place to address infill, but they're scattered throughout the code. It's hard to kind of, I think what we need to do is step back and make sure that you're defining infill situations appropriately and make sure for all the different categories of standards that we have given you different options, greenfield versus infill. Encourage flexibility. This is not a one-size-fits-all code. The goal needs to be to give you a robust toolbox that lets you, raise the bar for all projects, but do it in a different way with flexibility for different situations. Some codes allow alternative landscaping plans. So there's a base set of landscaping requirements, trees and shrubs, but you can propose some alternative. Same thing for parking. You've got a base set of minimum off-street parking requirements, but maybe you can propose shared parking, as an example of an alternative to that. There's a lot of different ways that we'll try to thread through opportunities for flexibility in the new code. At the same time, provide more certainty and consistency. One of the things that we heard is that with your current code, there's enough vague language, there's enough unanswered questions that people don't have a sense often of what they're expected to provide in terms of development quality. A lot of stuff gets thrown into the judgment box for staff. And so we need to try to look for the vague language to wring that out and to provide more clear standards for every category where we can to make things more specific. And then finally, reduce the use of SUPs by enhancing standards. If we can, I'm going to give you a whole list of standards on the next slide, types of standards, but in all those areas, if we can raise the bar in terms of what you're expecting for development quality, from parking to landscaping, et cetera, that's potentially another situation where you don't have to use an SUP to get at that issue. We talk in this report, y'all have a relatively complex system of SUPs in our experience. You use them for a lot of different situations, a lot of situations where I don't think you need to use them. So, for example, you use them for potential, grading sites, or you use an SUP for just a project that's in a certain distance from a residential neighborhood. If we can just beef up your standards to address grading and to address residential adjacency, you don't have to go through an SUP process for that necessarily. So one of our big goals here is to minimize the number of SUPs moving forward. So that's actually probably my slide that I'll talk the most on. This is all the topics where we're going to apply all those themes. And it's a lot of important things in your code. You have developed really thoughtful approaches in all these areas, from tree protection, to the grading of a site, to parking and loading. For all of these different categories, we are going to be working with you all and with your staffs to raise the bar. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on this slide because there's actually going to be a regular process where the staff is going to meet it's planned to be a monthly basis with you all to kind of lay out in more detail each one of these specific topics and to get your feedback on particular questions. But again, the goal for all of these is to raise the bar. A couple things I'd highlight. Access, connectivity, and circulation. That's going to be relatively new in this code. The idea here is that you're not trying to you don't want developments to result in fragmented neighborhoods. You're trying to weave developments together as much as possible so people can walk or people can bike and you don't have to necessarily drive everywhere. That can play out on an individual site level by requiring sidewalks. That can play out on a large subdivision design level by requiring multiple access points for a subdivision. So that's going to be a lot of new things that we introduce. Historic preservation, I'll mention also. That is something that it's potentially going to kind of rethink the preservation toolbox that you have and weave it more effectively, I think, into the rest of the code. I know that's pretty general, and this is all really important stuff, but it's kind of a preview of coming attractions. Just know that we're going to be looking at all this stuff through the lens of everything I mentioned on that prior slide. That's it. That's actually all we have on this second module. And I know it's high level, but we just wanted to check in and see if you had maybe any of these particular areas that you wanted to just give us specific comments on.
All right, thanks. Any comments from council? Councilman Breckus, 3 minutes.
Thank you. On the special use permits, I'm not so sure that Reno uses special use permits excessively. I think what they have is they have a dual characteristic as conditional uses within the zoning districts, and so they're multifaceted because we don't have that, and I guess that's a conversation for the standards. My focus on this is going to be the subdivision design. We're, basin and range, it's very difficult topography, and as we move into there and suburbanize, I'm really looking for what are the best practices that communities arrive at on subdivision design, on topography when they're suburbanizing. And and that gets into everything. Street widths is going to be very important to me. That's the access and connectivity, because I mean, sometimes it just seems like there's this informal agreement on a subdivision map, then it's going to get stubbed out for whoever, where, and whatever, and it causes headaches to everyone else because neighbors buy in and they don't realize that they've bought onto a stubbed out 42-foot right-of-way that is a collector street where their driveway fronts off to. So we've got to get that right. But I'm particularly concerned, and council had some discussion on this when we were adopting the most recent building code, is rockery walls. And we've had some rockery wall failures. I don't know. I mean, I feel like we want to get in, we want to get out of this code, but if there's some work to be done to really think about in the Reno context, what is the role of rockery walls? What do you do above a certain elevation? Mass grading concepts. I think that I would not mind seeing that hang out as a to-do thing, because those are very tough discussions and can be very involved too. So those are my comments on design standards. Thank you.
I'll go.
I think you've still got some council members.
Yeah, I have some. Yep. So originally I was going to ask for more SUPs. And why? Because the SUP part sometimes is where the public actually gets to participate and comment. And I understand your thought that if we have the design standards laid out better, that they won't have to have so many comments, right? Be so worried about buffering or whatever it is. But to that end, there was an if there. If they have the design standards laid out. And what I've observed in our town is we have a lot of HOAs that have very detailed design requirements for their HOA. Then we have places that might have CC&Rs with an architectural board. Like where I live, there's not an HOA, but there is an architectural review board, and I know there's others. But then it seems like some places need at least a design review board. So if you're not going to go there, some things I'd like you to think about are, what if you have a single family, how much % cover can you have of that house? Should there be a trigger, so if your house is 25% bigger, you want to expand your house on the lot, and maybe the lot is not that big, only 6,000 square feet or something. How much of the lot can you cover? Can you cover right up to the setbacks? Is that okay? Or can you cover the house as a certain % and maybe the impervious area as a certain %? Could that be built in? Could we have a basic design standard there? And then what if the person wants to go bigger? What's the exception or variance process? So I'd like you to think about that. And then I guess lastly, on your natural resource protection, I'm not really sure if that includes flood or not, because usually natural resource protection is talking about wetlands and animals and plants, and maybe it's talking about natural floodplains, but it is an issue in our town. And I'd love to see it up on your list of topics to be discussed, because I think we need some direction in there. And I like that you have the access and connectivity and circulation, because we keep putting it in, and even our planning director or myself often will say, well, they want to wall this whole thing off and make it like a mini gated, HOA gated community, but it doesn't increase, connectivity with the neighborhood. And why should it be this isolated? I mean, we seem to always be asking that question. So I'm going to be really looking forward to what you have to say there. And so think about this design review board, and does it have a role, especially if you have a neighborhood overlay? Maybe that's where it has a role, or not, Okay.
And just to clarify, we are coming back. We have a whole slide on design review board in the next section on administration. So we'll talk about
it's part of, okay, I thought it would be in design standards, because
they're very related.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
If I could make a fast point
Yes.
just on that point. We draft the code in modules, but you're not going to be able to see the big picture until everything gets put together.
Right.
And this is a good example of that. We might actually draft an initial use table that proposes SUPs for certain uses, or maybe scales them back to permitted uses, but you won't have seen the design standards necessarily yet until later in the project. And so it's not until you see the full set of tools out there until you're able to go back and evaluate, well, am I comfortable allowing this to be converted to an SUP, to a permitted use? So that's just a good example of how, yes, we break this apart in the drafting process, and you'll have to be a little bit patient until you see everything on the table before we know exactly how all the
Okay.
pieces fit
Well, just
together.
think about that public participation piece, and
Sure.
how do we ensure it, avoiding NIMBY and all that, but how do we ensure that the neighborhood cohesion's there?
And floods are included, flooding is included. in
Natural
resource.
resource, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Commissioners, comments on this? Commissioner Weisky.
Thank you. In your overall goals, you state provide more certainty and consistency. And then in your topics to be reviewed under landscaping, buffering and screening, site and building design, please start thinking now about buffering and distances and separation and shadowing. Our Planning Commission in the last several months has had numerous projects come before us with those as being major topics of discussion, stretching some of the agenda items out for well over an hour. And I would expect that the planning commissioners in the near future, when we start breaking down into smaller work groups, should be talking to you about that. So just a heads up to what's coming down the road.
Thank you, Commissioner Weisky. Commissioner Griffith.
I just wanted to highlight 2 items that I was happy to see on the list, and that's including parking. I'm really looking forward to delving that out, particularly in the urban core, and also the historic preservation. I think that that's really important, especially right now as we're seeing more growth and to protect our neighborhood. So I was happy to see both of those.
Thank you, Commissioner. Additional questions, comments? Commissioner Marshall.
I'd like to echo Commissioner Griffith's point on historic preservation. I'd like to see how you do that, but I think it's a critical piece. I also, kind of on the prior page, you have one bullet that says encourage flexibility, and the next 2 bullets say provide more certainty and consistency, and in essence, reducing SUPs by enhancing standards. And those 2 things, in my experience, they really work in opposite directions. And I would, while we like flexibility, a lot of what you're talking about is actually decreasing flexibility so you increase the efficiency of a process. So I very much would like to hear your guys' thoughts on how you do that and at the same time encourage flexibility for the development community so they can get projects done. And so that we don't have 1-hour meetings on, shadowing. I have a comment on, moving from SUPs to something else, but it really relates to the design review committee, so I'll talk about that then.
Thank you, Commissioner Marshall. Commissioner Gower.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this idea of distinguishing between infill and greenfield development is an important one. And it's something that we hear a lot in presentations to us, projects being billed as infill development. I can think of a recent PUD that we had that was billed as infill development. I'm not sure that it was. It was surrounded by infrastructure. It may have looked like infill, but it maybe didn't have the characteristics. So there are things like that that I think would help. I'm also cognizant that the Regional Planning Commission is looking at certain growth scenarios, and one of them includes smart greenfield development. And that's a concept that was sort of new to me, but I think it takes this idea of, infill type development and creating nodes of development in areas that aren't already developed. So how do those standards apply in situations like that where maybe it is greenfield, but it's in an area where infrastructure already exists or is planned, and our design standards can support development of a certain type in that area. So just some dynamics of those 2 words that are thrown around so loosely, I think, infill and greenfield, but they have a lot of a lot behind them, I guess. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Gower. Additional comments? I just want to throw out there, I can't believe none of my commissioners applauded the reduction in SUPs based on how long our meetings have been going. It's just, I thought that needed to come up. Staff is looking forward to that because then they have a lot more to do. So I would just like to echo Commissioner Gower's comment about the infill versus greenfield. That was one that I highlighted, and I think that can be continued not only through the code, but even as we start to get into some of the administrative aspects of things where we're looking at findings. Like the findings often are dramatically different between the two sets of, or types of development, but we don't currently have that flexibility. So I'd like to see that. So with that, Madam Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Go ahead, Councilwoman.
Thank you very much. I too was excited about the reduced number of SUPs, if it can be cleared up in other locations. And that's kind of a time thing. I mean, a resource and time thing. The delay is delaying bringing product to market, and that's not something we have a luxury of right now. So that concerns me. The thing that we've been trying to do at the city too, and maybe this, when you said the parking reduction for on-street parking consideration, you know, we set some money aside for an affordable housing initiatives, and one of them was how we could, and I know nobody likes the word incentivize, but to me, on-street parking could potentially be one of those issues that could be up for discussion. Is we looked at things that are, if it's an infill on a transit line, affordable, and it's a rehab, how do we get some sort of incentive to those individuals to make those things go vertical? Because right now they're really not happening. We clearly don't have cash to be rolling out there and giving for incentives in that regard, but I just wonder if that's some sort of tool here, if there's certain check boxes, how that may be looked at as a potential incentive to get some of these projects to go vertical.
Related to the development standards as well as the districts, I think the other thing that will come into play is that you have a lot of incentives built into your code already. And part of what we talked about through the master plan that would really need the detail of is how do you kind of evaluate what's working in different locations. I think what we've heard is incentive to us anymore. It kind of goes back to, you know, times change, demand changes. That's something, whether it's parking, you know, density bonuses, you know, all of those things really need to be looked at in the context of these new districts, calibrated. So you have a lot of those built in. It's just going to be a case of how do we make them more effective.
May I just, Madam Mayor, may I ask? Yeah, I mean, I know we have those incentives for subsidized housing, and if it's good for that sort, you know, and we need a lot of multifamily, why not make it across the code? And I know there's a lot of rethinking about, you know, incentives, density, and so on, which we, you know, are very liberal with density. My question to you is, are you seeing, I think there's an interest out in the world for, if you're going single-family residential, to not be in homeowner association, covenant-controlled with dues, communities for affordability and also some consumer preference. Do you see a way that codes can, through their subdivision design in Greenfield, maybe, you know, with our difficult topography, is you go a certain way and you cannot be in a covenant-controlled HOA community with maintenance dues and so on. This design takes you another way where everything that's dedicated is within the realm of the public to absorb and maintain. Are you seeing any codes come out that way and communities go that way? Because I don't think Reno's done a non-HOA subdivision in maybe a decade. I haven't seen one.
That's interesting. I have not written something like that myself, but I would like to talk about that with you more further. I can, let's have the conversation. I don't have an answer for you right now. Okay. Last topic is going to be administration. So how do we make decisions? How do you all make decisions about the code? I don't have a screenshot of the Reno code up here. I've just got a couple of images from other codes that we've done. The image on the left is a sample table of different procedure types. You have one of these in your code. We're just going to be going through that with a fine-tooth comb and thinking about opportunities to streamline and improve efficiencies and who does what. One of the things that we've done in many communities is on the right-hand side, streamline the pipeline for all applications, have common review procedures. So what's the standard process for a pre-application meeting? What's the standard process for how an application is submitted and processed? standard process for determining whether or not an application is complete. I think there's opportunities for standardization and predictability in all aspects of that for Reno, and we're going to be working, especially with your staff, to think through how to improve that whole system and to clarify it, visually like this, so people that are looking at the code and want to invest in Reno can come and see immediately. Okay, this is the process that I'm going to have to go through. So, I just have a few slides here on particular topics for you. Additional streamlining for efficiency. I mentioned this as a goal. Here's a couple of examples. And we've talked about this already. Reduced reliance on SUPs. You all have identified for us as a goal for the project. You do use SUPs quite a bit. You're getting at both the appropriateness of a use on a particular site, but you're also getting at quality issues. You're also getting at site and design issues. And as we've talked about already, especially on the site and design issues, we can get the standards better in the code to minimize the need for the SUP tool to get at that issue. Allow some projects through better standards and staff approval versus SUPs. Another way to streamline the process potentially is looking at site plan review. You've got a relatively flat process right now. You've got a relatively standard process that applies the same level of review, the same kind of length of review for all different types of projects, big and small. You're doing some things really well. You're already handling all these at the staff level, which many other communities are not doing. Many other communities, send site plans to planning commission or sometimes even to the council level. So I think it's great that they're already at the staff level. That's great. We can potentially improve the process even further, however, by trying to make it less flat, trying to identify big projects versus small, trying to think about a faster timeline, a more efficient timeline for the small stuff, so that the staff has more time to focus on the projects that have bigger community impacts, be it a sensitive location or a big size or sensitive uses. More substantial submittal requirements and a longer review time for big projects. You're requiring the same information for everything. You need more information for the bigger projects, and you might be able to get by with less for the small stuff. So again, this is a threshold defining issue. Here's our design review committee slide. So one of the things that we talk about in the memo is providing you better tools for design flexibility and alternatives. And there's two issues here. One is minor deviations. So this is just the small stuff. So if a project wants to come in and maybe can't meet the exact number of parking requirements, parking spaces it's got to provide, or it needs a slight adjustment in a setback, you have got a tool to allow that minor deviation. The point here of the memo is just that we want to make sure that we're fully exercising the authority to use that tool that you're given in state law. And we think you potentially could take that a little bit further and use that tool more broadly. So we'll be working with your legal staff and your staff to just make sure that you're taking full advantage of your ability to grant minor deviations. Because again, that's a great tool that keeps people from having to go to a variance or a PUDs. Design Review Committee. So this is fleshed out in the memo. But very briefly, the idea that's come up is, can we appoint a group of people that would serve as a committee to approve deviations from design standards in the code? So if you've got a new, tighter set of building design standards, maybe you've got a committee that's set up that meets on a regular basis to consider deviations from that. They potentially could have a larger role in the future. If you set them up immediately just to look at deviations, other communities use them in a broader role. They might consider all projects over a certain size, say. There's many examples throughout the country of how these committees are used and how they could be structured. You've got a lot of issues about, for example, who would serve on this type of committee. Do you require them to be architects by training, or do you allow just citizens at large, or do you have some mix of the two? You got a lot of questions about the authority of the committee. Do they look at projects that are just deviations or something broader? Do they look at projects just in certain key areas, or is it citywide? So there's a lot of kind of threshold questions there. We can go down that road. I think we're very interested today in just hearing your initial gut reaction to this idea of having a committee, if you think that would be appropriate in Reno. So that's a very high level. There's more detail in the memo about all those issues. Then I think finally, in terms of administration, amendments to entitlements. That's a typo on the top of that slide. This is an administration and procedures section. But in terms of amendments to entitlements, this is what I mentioned with Commissioner Hawkins earlier. We talk in the memo about the need to clarify the process for amending entitlements that are out there, distinguishing better between major and minor amendments, and in particular amendments to PUDs. The master plan recommends reviewing your approach for that. So I talked about that issue earlier. I think that's it. These are big issues getting at just the overall efficiency of the system in Reno. So anxious to hear your feedback on that.
All right, thank you. I can certainly tell that this is not, you're not new. Good job. Okay, go ahead, Councilman Breckus.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say, well, I met Mr. Goebbels like 2 weeks out of law school a long time ago.
Oh, you did?
In a community in rural New Mexico, coming off a small plane, and so I've seen his
Okay.
career evolve over the years in the decades, and it's been a joy to have a chance to work with him again, and Darcy too. We want the Planning Commission. It's their plan under state law to function at a very high level, right? You know, implementing the master plan. There's number one job, the big projects. Annexations and abandonments need to go to them, and projects all bundled. We've talked about that a lot. I am concerned with the Design Review Committee, which is citizen-based, that Reno's always had a hard time staffing the Planning Commission to the level I think a Planning Commission deserves to be staffed, with a lot of training, the focus, and I'm afraid of teeing up another committee. I think we can get to design issues a different way. I'm going to be staffed now to the Historic Resource Commission. The council budgeted them some resources for technical assistance on design. Now, Design Review Committee, I think, could have a role at a certain level for certain procedures, and that is the subdivisions. I think we need to get the subdivisions away from the Planning Commission and to a technical committee that can meet iteratively with the engineers, with all the disciplines, and get the Planning Commission, the subdivisions, to just, finally get done and iterative. And I know you've worked in Albuquerque, and that's, how I started out. They advertise to the public broadly on their first subdivision review, and then it might take 6 months for them of revisions to get it through. Planning Commissioner has never opened a hydrology report and considered and evaluated the rational method in their lives. Doesn't happen. And I think that subdivisions, other than the availability of the infrastructure with the technicians do and the services, I think is the way to go. And maybe through that, they can do the modifications on designs, but all subdivision activity, in my view. We have a hearing officer right now, but she and he listen to everything from sewer complaints, mostly to administrative appeals, to parking tickets. I think we need a specialized hearing examiner who is probably a land use attorney or a land use planner to evaluate the conditional uses and the variances, and some sort of process there, and be staffed. And that's the way I would go with it. So the Planning Commission is dealing with the large projects, the large design special use permit controlled sites, site plan control sites. And I know we've moved very much in the administrative site plan world. I'm not sure it's working as well as maybe we're saying. So, I'm going to be interested to see how you want to parse that out. But those are my view of procedures, which to me is probably the most important area for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually have a different view on the Design Review Committee. I think that's a great idea. I think we at the city, I don't think it's any secret that we have struggled, or our staff has struggled, with coming forward with a definitive answer for fear of our second-guessing that answer. And I think the Design Review Committee gives them a broad spectrum of experts and individuals that can affirm or not what their decision or opinion is on an item. I actually really think that's a good idea. I think it helps processing. I think it helps through, any sort of issues with treatments during hearings or appeals, and it gives staff the I don't know, gives them some assurances that a review committee has looked at their decision and has affirmed or denied what they believed. I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, two things. One, I really liked your idea on administrative discretion. One of the first projects I had here was someone had a remnant wall on their property. It had been a public facility, fire station. The city had sold it. It was going to be a dentist's office, and the wall was still sitting on the property. And they had all the HOAs around there wrote letters saying we're fine with the wall going away. And it took me months to figure out a process where the wall could go away. And lo and behold, it was written right in the front page of the PUD, which gave the administrator the discretion to make the wall go away or to make curb cut changes or to some small fencing changes. And I have been wanting for the last 4 years to take that paragraph off that PUD and put it into our code so that the administrator could have that kind of discretion on a lot of things, small things. That they don't deserve a variance because they're not, they don't reach the threshold for that, and they're not going to sustain it through our statutory review of a variant, what's a variance. But a deviation or a minor modification or making the wall go away and putting a see-through fence, which is what they wanted, or using the back of a garage for the wall instead of, they had a row of trees that were supposed to be squeezed between the wall and a garage. It was just crazy stuff that, an administrator can fix. And I love that. I also like the design review board, and I've already mentioned it about, 2/3 of the way back in your presentation. I think that it should have architects on it, it should have other kind of designers, because often architects have different architect aesthetic with each other, some like some kind of styles over other kind of styles, some are more adept at commercial versus residential construction, and those kind of things. So I'd like to see one, and I think it could help resolve some of these issues. I've seen too many times where things just aren't fitting. You guys talked about transition zones, going from one area to another. We were talking about ADUs before, and I happen to have two structures on my house. One's a mid-century modern low roof, and my garage is a pitched roof. And I was saying, which one do you want me to follow? And they're like, well, the main house. And I'm like, well, if I put a flat roof next to this garage, or low pitch roof, it's just going to not look good. But I would have liked to be able to go to a design review board and make my argument, those kind of things. I think maybe it starts out being kind of almost an appeal board or, in that category to get some experience with it before we get into review. But again, I have an architectural review committee. They review everything in whether it fits or doesn't fit, whether it meets the setbacks or not. They look it over and make sure it's consistent with. So anyway, I like the idea. So thanks. I'll tag you. You're it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I agree with the design review committee, but I think that we need to keep it it doesn't need to be another bureaucracy. We don't just need another committee to do it. I like the idea of it being more like our planning commissioners. Yes. Yeah, and it's a process where we can talk things through and be good neighbors. And that's what I want to see as a philosophy in all these things that we're doing is, are we being good neighbors to people that are already there with infill or with, are we going to be good neighbors with wherever we're doing zoning? If there's already been something in place for years, do we just go out and change it? And so it affects somebody somewhere along the line. So I just think that there needs to be a philosophy in our community and in the city of Reno that we're good neighbors, and that from the developers to our city administration and planning, that we're just good neighbors. So that's my thoughts.
All right, any other questions? No?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Commissioners, Commissioner Marshall.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, as I was reading a hydrology report the other night, and I'm certain that all my fellow commissioners are as well as educated as I am.
Hex method or rational method? You were not.
For the last 11 years.
Yes. I am looking forward to seeing what additional training I might need to serve in this role, but notwithstanding those things, I have some general comments about this efficiency notion, and been involved in a lot of planning agencies, one in particular, and there's oftentimes a perception of a trade-off between efficiency and accountability. And if we're really implementing the master plan, we're trying to move the look and feel of the city into something different. And the extent that we push decisions down and out of a public forum and into a less public forum, we might risk losing public support for the overarching goals of what we're trying to do. So I think it's very important when you are proposing these changes, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, that you discuss openly the consequences of where are decisions made, and then to some degree, I don't want to use the word power center, but who are you empowering and to make those decisions, and what kind of accountability do they have? I think that's a critical element to then when the city council makes those decisions about who should get what, there's a good understanding by not only them, but the public as to, where they're going to see things and what should be at what level. And that's kind of just my general, wanting to see that rationale, but a full rationale of why, if it's the planning manager doing minor deviations, what really does that mean? And, what could you see? Because we often get at the Planning Commission, the biggest audiences for the smallest deviations. And if you suddenly take that away, are you going to, is that all of a sudden you're going to see a lot of people saying, I never knew, I didn't, I never saw this, I didn't have a chance to speak, and what kind of response that we would get. But I know that increasing efficiency is important because we are dependent on new projects coming online to make the changes that we want to see. And so where the balance lies between those two things. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Marshall. Commissioner Olivas.
Commissioner Olivas, I'll kind of jump onto that. He jumped on a few of my comments. I guess I like the idea of the efficiency and streamlining and reducing the SUPs, but the public forum and the feedback has been something that has always been valuable to us and brings a lot of value to the decisions. So the balance in that, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear that. And I think that along those lines, also reducing SUPs, one thing that comes before us when we're talking zoning, there's no project. We'll deal with that and look at that when there's a project. And that's kind of our opportunity to evaluate a real project. So how that gets handled in a different process, I think, is important for that reevaluation in a public forum. I think Council Member Doer brought up variances, and that's one thing that I think is missing from this. Variances are something that have come before us, and I think that there's a lot of ambiguity in that, unfortunately, sometimes. I think that we've had examples of variances requests that maybe they're very appropriate and they make perfect common sense, but based upon the findings, we can't do them, and that just seems silly. I think the other side of that, too, is we've had requests come before us that they probably do make sense, and we should do them, but that's not the right vehicle for them, and then it becomes an emotional decision. So I think variances would be something that I would like to see a lot more discussion about and definition and clarity on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Olivas. Commissioner Gower.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share the sentiments about the SUPs. While I think I would appreciate fewer SUPs and shorter meetings when we sit here at midnight sometimes, I do recognize that it's a process for the public to engage in, and it's part of, the democracy of planning, and I think that's great. One of the things that we've talked about on Planning Commission, and I've asked our legal counsel about, is when an SUP comes for residential adjacency, for example, and we have this set of findings that deal with things that have nothing to do with residential adjacency, do we have to open up that full box of findings and consider the whole, the project or a whole or whatever the proposal is against that set of findings? Or are we just constrained to the findings that apply specifically to, you know, what's driving that SUP? And a lot of times it's the findings that are potentially outside of that box that not only create longer meetings, but it brings up a lot of concern on the public's part. So if we're clear about this SUP is being required specifically for this, and the findings are, you know, 1, 2, 3, not A through M or whatever they are, then I think that could build some efficiency into the process while maintaining that open forum for the public to engage on the process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gower. Additional comments? Commissioner Hawkins?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. One thing I've noticed over time is that developers complain about how long it takes their development to get through the process of staffing. Either we have a problem with not enough staffing, or maybe the project's too big. I don't know what it is, but we need to expedite some of these projects, because I've seen on our schedule that we get on our emails where we've got 7, 8, 9 items that are listed for us to hear. Then all of a sudden, a week later, those have disappeared and gone 2, 3 months behind. We're not helping anybody in the industry by pushing them back. And if it's because of staff, then we need to hire more staff in the planning department. But these developers shouldn't wait 2, 3, 4 years to build their development just because we're waiting for it to go through staff and the planning process. We've got to expedite some of these things. It's clear. And if it means we have to hire more staff for the planning department, so be it. But we can't keep pushing this stuff back. Hurts us.
Thank you, Commissioner. Additional comments? I'll make one. I want to circle back a little bit to the Design Review Committee. Speaking as the architect up here that does disagree with other architects, I think we have lots of different opinions on that. But one thing that I'd like to maybe keep in mind on this, and would be very curious as we're moving forward to hear how other jurisdictions have dealt with this. What's the makeup of that commission? Architects, landscape architects, contractors, planners. I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. I think I'm also looking at recommendations as to whether or not this can be a voluntary thing. I think a lot of the things that fall into the issue of Design Review Committee are not necessarily things that would come across either the Planning Commission or the Council's purview. It would be for individual building permits. It would be for conversations where the code is prescriptive rather than descriptive. And so there's a question as to whether or not you're meeting the intent. And I think I would be curious, and I think this is where the Design Review Committee could come into play as a voluntary option that could be done, maybe not to circumvent a special use permit process or even a variance, but really even down to the nuts and bolts of the development code on a site-by-site basis. So I would like to hear about that. Again, maybe not on the macro level that we're seeing up here, but on the more project-by-project basis, where it could be an owner that wants to do something a little bit different with their articulation or with their fenestration pattern or something like that, where the code and the staff may not be able to come into agreement, and the Design Review Committee could be an option to look at for that. So I appreciate the comments about it, again, on the macro scale, but I'd like to really hear about that as we're diving down onto the more project-by-project basis. Commissioner Gower, did you have a follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, I think it's important to think about also is the makeup of the Planning Commission, and having someone like yourself on the commission being able to say the things that you just said about buildings that none of us could say is important also. So it's been valuable to have an architect on the commission. I don't know if that's something that you've seen of, you know, makeups of the commission with certain expertise, but I can certainly vouch for the chairman's expertise relative to design and how it's helped us out a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and no, I didn't pay him for that, just so everybody knows. Commissioner Marshall, real quick.
Yes, this is actually going back to the PUD section. We kind of moved on quickly. Is that appropriate now, or are we going to have a separate? Anyway, I'll go ahead. Bill Thomas had an interesting point about looking at PUDs and setting almost criteria for entry. And to see, I was thinking about it in terms of, trying to disincentivize the use of PUDs, so we don't have to deal with the problem that they actually lock in rules, and then we lose flexibility. But to see that, to set up, I don't know if it's in codes or standards or what, to say not just here are the types of community benefits that we see, but the conditions upon which it is appropriate. And I think, Bill, I think that's what you were talking about, as to why would we want to deviate and go with the PUD route, and to have some, fairly strict guidance on what that might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. Madam Mayor?
Madam Mayor?
All
Wanna
right,
follow up?
Councilwoman Dewar.
Yeah, one thing that I was just waiting to see if it was mentioned, it wasn't, so I wanted to follow up. And that is, you said this section's about administration, right? And so 4 years ago, I proposed a change in the way that we do noticing, and so that it's more understandable by the public, which is one of your goals, is to make the code more accessible to the public and, to everyone involved in the process. So I would love to see, I've given a lot of recommendations over to our staff. It just hasn't risen, I think, to the level, of urgency. But since you're working on Title 18 and it talks about noticing, I'd love to see it addressed. I could speak to you separately about some ideas I have. And number two, and I'm a little hesitant on this, but I should just leap in off the diving board. I'd like to see a little bit more certainty about our appeal process and standing. And I don't know if those are covered in Title 18 or if you're only focused on 18, but we always have to make these determinations about standing. I think it would be good also to set some standards about who has standing. And in many communities, we had a group here, Scenic Nevada. They don't necessarily live 500 feet from that sign, but they have very valuable opinions to share. Do they have standing to bring an appeal or not? In many communities around the country or cities, they do, because they're an organized nonprofit for the purpose of that thing, or a Sierra Club or anything like that. If it's an issue, or a floodplain organization about flooding issues. Do they have to, we notice 350 feet or 750 feet, excuse me. Is it just within the 750 feet? That you have standing, or is it anyone in that neighborhood, or is it anyone in the city of Reno, or is it anyone in the Truckee Meadows? Do you have to be a landowner? Can you be a renter? All of these are subtle questions, but we almost always have to make a determination, and I'd love to see some of that a little bit pinned down, or bring us some proposals from some other communities and how they interpret that. Is that something, that's reasonable to include here?
Yes, very much. I don't think we've talked very much about that internally with staff, but it's,
Right.
It's definitely, I think, within our purview as part of this
Yeah.
project. As with so many of the other topics we've mentioned, there's a spectrum of approaches out
Right.
there. Some communities say that any person adversely affected by a decision, it's a very broad definition of standing.
Right.
Anybody can come in. Other people limit it to the folks that have participated in some earlier stage of the process.
Correct.
There's options. I need to brush up on NRS for that issue.
Right.
And we'll talk with staff. But that's
So I would really appreciate, because it would help us, it would relieve us from some, both the
Yeah.
Planning Commission and us, from some stress. And also, I think, and this just came up recently, and maybe it's more about a building permit than a development code, which I think building are in another code, but it had to do with how, once you're issued one of these things and you can appeal it, I'd just as soon see that the time clock, is told until the appeal period runs. And I don't know, again, if that's covered in this Title 18 or in another Title 5 or some other title. So if you could just check into that. But I think it's important to just add some clarity. Thanks.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, and to that point, I think if you're going to collect information about kind of what other jurisdictions are doing about the narrow or broad nature of appeals, would also be interested to know in other jurisdictions that what is handled administratively that we handle on appeal, to understand,
Right.
what maybe are we getting into that other jurisdictions don't. And then when we do, what are the definitions of standing for that as well? Thank you.
May I, Madam Mayor, just, when a community's done all this work on a master plan and a zoning code, you really, that value of land use is stable, stability to neighborhood is a presumption in my mind that the master plan for a particular property is correct, the zoning is correct, we've done all that work, and the justification of the burden of making that change is somewhat high. And so the Planning Commission, looking at the zoning map, well, tell us why it needs to be changed. Oh, you're telling us a zoning change with a special use permit, so they're tied. Now we get a better, fuller picture. I mean, I'm looking for that kind of framework and presumption on those levels, because that's the meat and potatoes of the Planning Commission. But then NRS seems very odd to me in these rote findings. I mean, obviously you want a record of decision to explain why you did what you did and to defend if you have to take it into judicial. But also, these rote findings in Nevada are very peculiar to me. The PUD comes up with, if you have a master plan, a PUD, you've got master plan zoning, PUD, you've probably got 35 findings, and it just seems to me that I don't know that NRS requires you to do it a certain way. So I'll be looking at how the decision-making is articulated, and that record of decision is produced, and your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We've thrown a lot of terms out here. So just wanted to share with you kind of the perspective from the staff we're talking about, so we're all on the same page. The appeal process is by its nature a very adversarial process because you have a proponent and an opponent. So we would try to design a system that rarely ends up in appeal because that's not where we want to be. Getting to design review, because a lot of times people get confused on variances, deviation, which I would say is kind of a light version but not a variance, and the design review committee. I think the concept we're talking about is when a variance is asked for, it's somebody's telling you the rules shouldn't apply to them. So that's a very different standard, which you have a burden of proof to say, why shouldn't the rules apply to you? The concept we've talked about is when we write these rules, people have a choice, right, which is to follow the rules. If they follow the rules, it should be a fairly quick process because you should get to beginning to end if you follow all the rules very quickly. But invariably, somebody comes in and says, well, the rules, and we would have to agree with them, didn't really pick up my case. There's something unique about my case. So it's not really a variance. It's almost like a proof to us that this new design is better than what we structured in our code. And so to me, that would be, or the staff level conversation, that would be a good use of the design review committee. In other words, prove to us with a group of experts why whatever you've come up with is better than following the rules. So it gives the person a choice. If they're going to go through what is a subjective, can be lengthy, can be somewhat arbitrary process, it's their choice. Like we didn't make them go there because they'll get very frustrated if they're just trying to do something they think is in the rule book and they have to go through a very subjective process. But if they really do have a project that's better than what our code is, they should be comfortable going to a design review committee because they can explain why it's better. So that's kind of the concept we've talked about, separating those three things. So if you really want to show us why the rules shouldn't apply to you, then there's a very high bar. But if you want to do something that's an alternative, then we've set up a process to let them prove to us why it's better than the code.
Thinking about, and I don't know, I'm just thinking about solar right now, and I've heard that, and I don't really know that this happened in Reno, Nevada, but I've heard that some HOAs are restrictive on what they'll allow solar-wise or whatever, and I don't know where the meat in the middle is of our rules as a city versus the HOA rules. Can we overcome the HOA rules? Like, for example, like we say, solar is allowed on every roof in Reno, Nevada, and an HOA can't restrict that. Is that something we legally can do? I'm not saying it's good or bad. Oh, I'm sorry, someone answered that question? Yes?
Generally, you've got the private covenants that are placed on the land, and then you have our code, and never the twain shall meet. So unless there's a state law that preempts the ability to have that covenant or that restriction,
Okay. I wasn't necessarily advocating for it, but I wanted to understand it. So thank you, Mr. Shipman. But if there are some overarching policy prescriptions that we have, let's say about connectivity, and it is at odds with maybe where an HOA or a new association wants to go, maybe in the time they're being created, I think they have to accede to what we're suggesting on connectivity and all the things that we're recommending, and not say, no, in our HOA, you don't connect, or something. I don't know. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think what you're talking about, and given what the city attorney said, when we do require in developments a copy of their draft CCNRs. That might be the opportunity where before there's actually people who've bought into it that have had this private agreement, we would say, if you want that approval, you need to strike that thing that says you can't have solar. Now, it doesn't stop them from coming back later, but it's a much harder thing to do after the people have moved in because you have to have a huge number of people agree to it.
Yeah.
So that's the way we could do it, but we can't, I think like the attorney's saying, once these private parties
Right.
agree to something, we can't interfere with it.
But prior to, yeah, so proactively. Okay, just some thoughts. I don't know the answer, but.
All right, any other questions? All right, seeing there are none, is there anything else you want to add?
Just thank you. No, this is exactly the feedback that we were looking for. So you will be seeing us, and especially the staff, on a regular basis to get more feedback. But thank you all so much. This is, I think, a really good just opportunity for course correction.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. Great job. All right, at this time, Madam Clerk, I'm going to send it back to you for public comment.
Madam Mayor, public comment for this item. The first to speak is Donna Keats, followed by Peter Newman.
Wasn't prepared for that. Hi, I'm Donna Keats. Thank you for your presentation and for your participation, and thank you, few of you who brought up the public's interest in all of this, because it sounds like this is just, to me, you have a grand conceptual model going here, which is great, and you're homogenizing a lot of things. I think there's maybe a little bit of a problem in that Reno is not a community that can be homogenized. So the application of, say, an area plan or a neighborhood plan or whatever you choose to call it as a NIMBY thing, I think that's a mistake. I think it's a useful tool to recognize the unique areas of our city. I also think that everything that's been discussed today, I understand why the conceptual model is presented this way, but it's geared towards making it easier for developers and easier for the people who have to approve projects. Meanwhile, you have another 150,000 citizens. You didn't mention anything about the multi-use, the uses that you're planning to change in the single-family neighborhoods, with only the older ones without HOAs, as Naomi said, none in 10 years. Everybody's got HOA. So you have a huge population, I forget the number, 17,000 people that are about to be affected by your single-family neighborhood changes. I personally have said many times, this to me is about openness in government, not so much whether you have different kinds, somebody has a duplex or a student in the garage across the street. I honestly don't care. But I think what you're doing here is bypassing a lot of the opportunity for public participation, which is why it got all the way to council. So you're going to bring ADUs back in. We're not fooled about this, the fact that council denied it. It's going to come back. We know it's going to be there. So this makes it much more difficult for people who don't want it to have the opportunity to speak against it. What are all the other multi-uses? Do SF4 homeowners know that they're about to become a multifamily neighborhood, not a single-family neighborhood? I don't think so. So we have this whole issue about public process. We got all the way to council. You were surprised by how could people say they didn't know about this? And we can have a discussion. I can explain that to you exactly why nobody seemed to know about it along the way. And I think with this process, you're going to end up in the same place on these different pieces that are going to come back in because of the people you're not engaging in. Thank you, Jenny, for bringing up the fact that these meetings are open. As I look at those lists, I see that you're inviting users of the code, developers, professionals. I know a lot about this code. I've been doing this for 20 years, but I sat on the Title 18 review on accessory structures back in the mid-2000s when Jenny was doing that. I mean, I'm not unfamiliar with this, and I never was under the impression that I had an opportunity to participate or that anybody actually cared. So I think this gets to be a problem when it gets to the people who have to make the decision, because there is, in fact, a lack of engagement with the other 150,000 residents and the 16,000 homeowners who think they live in single-family neighborhoods who don't know that in 2 years they won't. Somebody needs to tell them you're going to double their density. And that's why you get hung up at the end. So if you actually want this to move forward, I'm here to suggest that you maybe think about this or the presentations in a little bit of a different way to make sure that doesn't happen again the next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Peter Newman, followed by Andrew Samuelson.
What she said. One of the biggest problems that I see, and I'm not an expert on planning at all, like all of you are, and by the way, I want to just take this opportunity to thank particularly the members of the Planning Commission. They are the unsung heroes in all this. They don't get paid. They sit through meetings like on the ADU till midnight, and we really owe them a lot. And I agree, it's nice to have an architect as the as the chairman. And you certainly do.
No, you get no extra credit.
But thanks to the city council also, because you do get paid a little bit, but probably not enough. And the planning is so important to our community. And one of the big things, as Donna mentioned, is the notice and an opportunity to be heard. That, I think, is the biggest concern. And I hope the concept of the Clarion Associates that they'll include this concept as such an important part, that there has to be notice and an opportunity to be heard at every step of the way, no matter how the rules come out. And that has not, I don't see that in the overall plan that they have, or the summary of the plan that I'm sure they intend to do that. But notice is so important. And the other thing is enforcement. That nothing has been said in the summary about the enforcement. Now, as Ed Hawkins said, we need more people on this. We need to spend more tax dollars on staff. I think we also need to spend more tax dollars on enforcement. There are illegal uses of property going on right now that have been called to the attention of the city, and they just keep going on. And I understand that the code enforcement people just do not have the resources, and I think that needs to be addressed as well. Thank you for doing all this. I really appreciate it.
All right, great comments. Thank you.
Andrew Samuelson, followed by Leah Sanders.
Hello, I'm Andrew Samuelson. I'm a small developer. With regard to our central neighborhoods, the master plan that was just passed focuses heavily on walkability, bikeability, infill, density, and these are the types of projects that I work on. The single biggest killer of project ideas is parking requirements, the way they are now. They make projects more expensive at a time when they need to be more affordable. We need more housing. We have a housing affordability crisis and availability crisis, not a parking crisis. I think they're not necessary in general. It's a prime example to me of a kind of a simple government regulation gone wrong, short-circuiting a free market that works pretty effectively. For example, a developer is going to be incentivized to provide the right amount of parking, or else they're not going to be able to rent their units. A bank underwriting a loan for that development is going to also check. There's various other market checks. Parking minimums distort transportation choices. They're a subsidy for single occupancy automobile users. I think a couple possible solutions is just completely eliminating them. Don't even talk about it in the zoning code at all. This actually has been done all over and works pretty well. It doesn't cause any kind of Armageddon for the reasons of those other checks and balances that I spoke about. If not that, which might be crazy, we at least need reductions in the central neighborhoods where there's investments in transit and walkability and bikeability, bike lanes, cycle tracks, that kind of stuff. So I would say, as someone who's actually working on this stuff, if we really, really want infill density, like we've said in the master plan, if we really want it, we have to relax parking requirements. Thank you.
All right, good job.
Leah Sanders.
Hi, I'm Leah Sanders, resident of Reno, and lots of familiar faces. I got drawn into this planning, Clarion and everybody else through ADUs affecting my neighborhood, not my particular neighborhood, which was exempt, but everybody else surrounding me. So I am speaking as a citizen of Reno. First, I would like to thank the Planning Commission for those countless hours, those meetings delayed to into the next meeting, to the next meeting, to the next meeting, while they evaluated all the ups and downs of how the accessory dwelling units were going to affect neighborhoods. I echo Donna's comments. I echo Peter's comments. And I want to say that, again, established neighborhoods have a character that is crucial to who Reno is. And we aren't talking so much about that. We don't look at the whole big picture of Reno, of the quirky houses and the HOAs and the big fences and the rock walls. All of those together as an aggregate make up Reno. So making overlays and big changes takes some caution. And also what I find missing from all of this is how are you going to evaluate whether it's working? You're making all these changes as if, bingo, it's a magic silver bullet or wand or abracadabra, and everything's going to be fine, which, of course, it hasn't been. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in this position now. So are there checks and balances along the way to see from the community, from those 150,000 people, whether this new plan is working? Thank you.
Greg Evangelitos.
Madam Mayor, Chairman of the Planning Commission, for the record, I'm Greg Evangelatos. I'm a professional city planner. I've been practicing planning in the state for 40 years. I live at 1365 Hilltop Road in Reno, and I'm going to try to cover 3 areas. The first area is I applaud the effort in terms of, at the staff level, the consultants. I think you've picked an excellent group of consultants. I believe you're very attentive to this process, and I think it's an important implementation tool now that you've done your master plan. So I want to compliment all of you. The second area is, as a practitioner, I've experienced some of those frustrations in terms of, let's call it the layer cake of the comprehensive plan, an area plan, the corridor plan, and then going in and having overlaps and contradictory responses in terms of, well, what actually am I under? What if you call it jurisdiction, or what set of guidelines am I under? Do I need a special use permit? Do I need a site plan review? So I need to get back to the basics in terms of clarifying to both the citizenry and the development community, this is how you come in the process, these are the expectations, this is how you go out. My sense is there's been some open-endedness to this process, and I think this is an excellent starting point in terms of focusing on this. The third area, and I think somebody made the comment about participation, about 30 or 40% of the people here are probably, because of the ADU discussion, activating their antennae in terms of how these rules and regulations affect their lives. And the comment that some of the neighborhood plans were retired, which is the Newlands plan, perception of maybe that the faith was broken. And I think that maybe reinstituting the neighborhood planning process, or kind of going back and looking at that, because I think one of the women earlier spoke to the character, the texture. And this is critical to the preservation of the quality of life of this community, is to have the mechanical way of doing this in such a way that we still get the right types of developments, but in the context of this community. The third issue, and I've been a practitioner and worked on large planned communities in northern Nevada and southern Nevada and so on. The planned unit development concept was years ago started when you had 152, 300, 400 acres of land. Whole towns were being designed. And so you had on-site density transfer, you had natural resources and scenic views you were trying to protect. So that allowed for that tool. What's happened over time is the implementation has been dropped down to 5-acre sites where really should it be that? And I think the comment, the Clarion people, about maybe having 90% of your standards be standard and 10% be those that you're discussing and negotiating. And finally, I understand the variance process versus minor deviation. You may even think about major deviations. If there's something that's in the community good that you should consider, maybe there should be a vehicle for that. Thank you.
Do you have a job? Do you have a job?
Do I have a
Yeah.
job? No, I'm semi-retired. My age is getting to me. No, I
Come
love this.
apply.
I love this line of work, and I love what this is about.
Yeah, I think great comments. And when you talked about sort of these complex overlays and things like that, do you realize sometimes staff doesn't even know because it is that complex? And then guess what? That's what they've been told. And you have someone going to go do a project thinking it's one way and spending a lot of money, a lot of time, and coming back, and that's not what it was at all.
Well, and that's
So you made a very good point.
And if I may at least follow up on that, this has happened over many, many, many years. And so it isn't one group of people doing it, it's the composite of all the good intentions.
Sure, totally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Madam Mayor, it should be noted for the record, Lori Ray and John Hara, representing Scenic Nevada, did not wish to speak. However, they would like council to add scenic views and dark skies into the code. Irish Jewel Peppard, representing One Truckee River, is concerned rezoning in regards to the approvement by City Council in September and would like to be considered a stakeholder. Ted Schroeder did not wish to speak, however, is concerned about ADUs being implemented with code changes. With that, I have no further public comment, Madam.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone that has participated. I'm so glad that you have witnessed our community participation. That's one thing that I think Reno is an incredibly caring community, and they come out, and they're incredibly vocal, and I think that's important. I think one of the planning commissioners talked about, maybe it was you, Mr. Marshall, about how we will listen, or maybe it was Mr. Olivas, but about, hearing different things from the community is so essential to what we do. Because if we don't hear from you, then we're going to shape your community how you probably don't want it. So we want to hear from you, and that's super, super important. And I also don't, all neighborhoods are not built the same. Can be incredibly different, but I think going back to, the preservation piece of it and the character and things like that, that's one of the reasons people say, gosh, I love Reno so much more than Vegas. Now, I apologize anyone that lives from Vegas, but they always talk about like the neighborhoods versus in Las Vegas, they don't have that sort of feel unless it's like really old Las Vegas. But I'm talking about, we do have very specific neighborhoods in Reno, and that's what makes it so special and really gives us that community feel. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming out, because I think you surprised him, because he said usually no one shows up, and I know that, for some people this can be boring or overwhelming, or, we all get into this other aspect of, I remember, my first day on council, I didn't know what a PUD was. So we all, we're all talking like insider language speak, and so it gets a little difficult if you don't know what that is. But so I just want to say thank you so much. But I really also want to say, because I don't know how you guys do it, your job is so difficult, and you do a phenomenal job. And I see you guys stay here, so late at night until it gets done. And I know you're working so hard with very little staff, and that's our team right here. You guys are amazing. So I want you to know that, Claudia and Nathan, and you guys are just awesome and dedicated. So I want you, and I know you come up here and you present projects, but I want you to know how much we appreciate it when you come up here. I know it takes a lot, and sometimes, you get tough questions and even combative council members, and you don't deserve it, but I want you to know that we appreciate you very, very much. So anyway, thank you so much.
Madam,
Wrapping that up, go ahead,
can I just
Councilmember
say one
Breckus.
thing? I appreciate Mr. Samuelson's comments about parking requirements. I think he's representing what the future is, what the academic and the research and the market research is. We've had success in dropping parking regulations in the California Avenue District, and we're probably not going to get there 100%, but I think we need some options to see how far we could go, would like to go, evidence-based to what that's doing to housing affordability in our community and others, because it is an issue that has to get tackled. My last point, again, is on subdivision design. I am concerned that the technical work in analyzing subdivisions through the tentative map timeframe is not getting the work done to consider the flooding risk that comes. A lot is being held off to final mapping, and then by that time, the vested right stands a lot. I don't know, I am not involved in that inner workings, it's the engineering staff, but I am asking you to please look at our preliminary and final tentative mapping, the level of detail that comes, because I feel we need a more iterative, refined process to really understand what's going on, particularly in our growth areas where we have these closed basins, but also uphill where everything's coming down. I don't think that process is working well, and I think it's a contributor to some of the flooding risk that we are seeing and trying to get a handle on. So thank you very much for letting me make those comments, Madam Mayor.
Sure, absolutely. Anyone else? No? Mr. Samuelson, but we should be pushing people to drive a lot less, right? I mean, I think, well, I mean, and back to Councilwoman Breckus, I totally agree with you about the parking requirements, for sure. So, and think about it, like with the senior housing project, when we know it's going to be predominantly seniors or those things, you don't need as many parking spaces. So just being more cognizant. But anyway, okay, wrapping this up. Any comments from your side of the aisle?
Commissioners? Mr. Gower?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to echo the mayor's comments about staff, we have hardworking, well-prepared, professional, knowledgeable staff, and as a commission, we're lucky to have you. So thank you.
All right.
Excellent, well said, thank you.
All right, anything else? No? That being said, then I'm going to ask my council for a motion to adjourn.
Madam Mayor, just for clarification on the record, we don't have any general public comment.
Oh, no general? Okay.
No general, so
I
now
thought
you can.
that was general, sorry.
That was on the presentation,
Okay,
so now
so-
you can take your motion.
Okay, I'm going to ask from the Reno City Council a motion. I have a motion.
You don't
No.
have to take any action today.
So just a motion, a second. All those in favor say aye. All those
Commissioners.
opposed? Motion carries. Go ahead.
Commissioners, motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion and a second, all those in favor? Aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously.